are people taught? You know, when you go through as a nurse, when you do your studies, you know, how are people actually taught how to deal with, you know, large-scale disasters?
Yep, so there's been a few research projects about that. So looking at from a nursing perspective at undergraduate programs, there was a survey done of undergraduate programs in Australia, and very few, less than 10%, actually had any element of disaster content in them at all. The second part, then we did a survey of postgraduate courses, and we particularly looked at emergency nursing postgraduate courses, of which there's about 10 or 12 around the country. I think there's 12 around the country, 10 participated in our survey. Of that, only 7 had anything to do with disasters in their content. And of that, some of their content might be very small amounts of content. For example, it might be a guest speaker coming in for half an hour. It might be a reading that they have to do. It doesn't necessarily embed the idea about what to do and how to do in disaster training, right? Perhaps that's because the day-to-day business of the hospital isn't about disasters. It's about people with chest pain, shortness of breath, abdominal pain, fractured limbs, and so on. From an emergency department perspective, that's what it's about. So maybe you don't put the education and training into disasters because it's the one-off event that you might not even see, that might not affect your hospital, so why would you?
It's a really interesting in terms of how training looks for you know, people coming through and the day-to-day type of stuff. Do you think, you know, if there's, you got into this through going through St. John's Ambulance and all of that type of thing, in terms of opportunities for young people who are interested in this side of stuff, are there opportunities to get involved to, you know, the logistical side, the communication side, you know, thinking of careers in the next 10, 20 years? Do you think with some of the changes happening, we're certainly seeing more disasters, environmental, chemical, terrorism, all of that type of thing. Do you think there will be changes in opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think whenever disasters happen, there's still going to need to be people with people interaction. That's never going to be lost. So there's still opportunities there in how we enhance that in terms of ensuring that the right people get the right care at the right time. The innovation, I think, comes from how that's improved to be better. So that doesn't make sense, how we improve to be better, how we can improve the current situation. So how do you train someone at the right time, for example? Is it at the undergraduate program? Is it at a postgraduate program? Should all institutions be doing it? Is it, again, that just-in-time training that needs to happen because disasters are different? And is it more about ensuring that nurses have an awareness of what a disaster is and what their likely role is going to be? But then when the disaster happens, know that healthcare professionals are critical thinkers, they're problem solvers, they're working every day at capacity. If you ask most healthcare professionals what their emergency departments are like at the moment, they'll say it's a disaster. That's just how they work. So it's about how we, I think, engage other people outside of the health perspective who may already have some solutions to problems around communication, just-in-time education and training to ensure that we can have best outcomes for patients. Some examples have been things such as when we do have respiratory illness, for example, we have these big cupboards which are called disaster cupboards, and you go to the disaster cupboard and you get out your respiratory mask and your backpack with your oxygen in it so you don't become exposed to people. I doubt though that many hospitals are actually physically getting those out on a regular basis and putting them on and trying them. What's happened in Hong Kong following bird flu was that a part of their induction program, each nurse got a card, and on that card had the size mask that they needed, the size bodysuit that they needed, and so on. So when the disaster happened, they tried all this on during the induction program. Then when the disaster happened, they could turn up to the cupboard, open the door and go, I need mask A, suit C, and they could just pull off what they needed off the shelves. Most healthcare professionals today in most hospitals probably don't know what they need to fit them.
So nurses are very often the front line of so many things, and there's certainly been with all of our walk-in clinics and all of that there's been an increasing push to get nurses sort of more involved in that kind of thing. How do we attract more nurses? Have we got enough of them? Is this an area where we really need to get our young people thinking about this as a really valued career?
Yep, absolutely. So what we're starting to see in health from a nursing perspective is what I would call scope creep. So the scope of practice for a nurse is changing dramatically. So what a registered nurse used to do in terms of general day-to-day caring for patients, the enrolled nurses are now doing. And what the registered nurses are now doing are more general practice, junior doctor type roles, particularly in a primary care perspective in emergency departments. So nurses are doing more things around suturing, x-rays, ordering pathology, interpreting pathology and discharging patients without any involvement from a healthcare professional other than themselves. So they're starting to work in a more autonomous role. We saw that around H1N1 in 2009, where many hospitals opened up influenza assessment clinics. So instead of having all patients with flu-like symptoms present to your emergency department and potentially spread their flu-like symptoms with patients that don't have flu-like symptoms, who are compromised because they've got cardiac disease or respiratory disease from other causes, moved the influenza clinics down the road a little bit. So anyone who presented with influenza-like symptoms, send them all down to the influenza clinic together and keep them segregated from the general population and assess them there. A lot of that was nurse-led. So a lot of the way in which patients were assessed, managed, pathology sent and so on was nurse-led in those types of clinics. So I think nurses have a larger role to play, particularly around some of the primary health issues, which we see over and over and over again. The walk-in clinics is a good example, I think, of where the nurses have an autonomous role in terms of providing healthcare, and sometimes a much more challenging role. You know, someone could present to those environments with a sore thumb, and you need to problem solve what's wrong with the sore thumb. And on occasions, it may be that they've got a blood clot in their thumb, and you need to refer them somewhere, and it results in a larger disease of what's going on in their body in terms of coagulation. So nurses still do a lot of critical thinking and problem solving, higher levels of assessment of patients, a lot more referral. In disasters, they're really important because they commonly know vulnerable populations in the community. They know how to link with them. They know how to link with pharmacies and GPs. So they become a bit of a pivot point in the community, along with GPs. GPs in the community, particularly in disasters, are somewhat overlooked, I think, and have a much larger role to play as well. Commonly in disasters, we'll send out, first of all, the acute care type nurses, people from the emergency department, theatres and intensive care. But after the first little while, day or so, it's no longer about that. It's more about mental health, community nursing. As I said, people have minor injuries, but often people will present to evacuation centres, for example, with a sore toe. They don't want their sore toe fixed. They just want to talk to somebody about what's happened in the disaster. And they commonly want to talk to somebody who hasn't been affected by the disaster. So they're more likely to talk to nurses, for example, who have come from outside of their jurisdiction into the disaster-affected area. So if we had another disaster in Canberra, we found that people are most likely to talk to people from, for example, coming from Sydney to Canberra rather than people in Canberra themselves, because they feel that the Canberrans would have already had the drama and the stress associated with being involved in a disaster. They don't want to burden them with any more of that. So they kind of offload emotionally to people who haven't been necessarily affected by the disaster.
You've brought up the sort of mental health aspect to it, and obviously being a nurse and seeing so many confronting situations, how do we make sure that our first responders in terms of nurses are actually looked after? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So on a day-to-day basis in the emergency department, we see stressful things, we hear stressful things about people's situations, we see really dramatic and horrific things. It's different in a disaster. In the in-hospital environment, on those occasions, there's normally a team of people around to support me. There's normally a team of people that can support the patient. But in a disaster, we'll hear those stories from multiple patients throughout the whole entire disaster. There's less support sometimes for health professionals because they're stretched themselves in terms of the ability to care for the healthcare professionals. So sometimes the same level of emotional support or debriefing capacity just isn't there around disasters. We know that people who have been deployed to disasters, for example, can come back from the disaster, and some people get offered regular phone calls, some people get offered regular face-to-face conversations. Some people have that occur in the disaster itself, where they can talk to people, padres or chaplains or psychologists or whatever in the disaster itself. And some people come back and there's just a disconnect between them and what's just happened. And then nurses, for example, are expected to return back to normality of life. So they've come from this life of being in the normal community. They'll go and help in a disaster where their world becomes almost like this tent-like city. Tents of where they live, tents of where they work in terms of the disaster setup, where people come, they live and breathe that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a time, and then they'll come back to Australia. And within days they may be expected to return to work. So in days they're obviously expected to go to the supermarket. People get overwhelmed by going to the supermarket because they've come from this place where they've just seen absolutely nothing and people with nothing, and you're sending people away essentially back to their homes to die because you can't help them, back to Australia where you're overwhelmed with the choice of what's in the supermarket. You get overwhelmed by driving down the street because you haven't seen a car for a month. You get overwhelmed when you go back to work to the emergency department and the patient at 4 o'clock in the morning who comes in with their sore knee, which they've had for 4 weeks, demanding to be seen now by somebody, just tips you over the edge. And that's what happens to our health professionals. It might only seem like something small and everyone else will look at them and go, what's going on? It's only a sore knee. But for them, the need to have ongoing offerings of support, I think is really important. People manage this in different ways. If we have a bad day at work, which everyone has bad days, we have bad days too. If we have a bad day at work, there's different ways in which people will cope with that. So it's about letting people have their own coping ways, but also about providing them with opportunities for support to take on board if they so wish.
And it potentially could be quite a long period of time after a disaster has happened, and we're talking about many more people who have been involved in caring in some way, that our disaster management period is not just the planning up front, the actual management. It could be 12, 18 months afterwards.
Yeah, right.
That we're still seeing the effect of what happened.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in a disaster management perspective, I'd like to put things into phases, or almost boxes. For me, you can't put it into boxes. These things are so overlapping and intertwined to one another. When does response start and finish to then recovery start and finish? It's almost like recovery is starting straight away anyway. But the recovery for people in terms of their exposure to disaster differs. When do you recover? Some people never recover. We can think about recovery from an infrastructure perspective. And there's even right now in Christchurch parts of the city which haven't recovered from an earthquake 2011 from a sewerage and water and electricity type perspective. So we think of infrastructure recovery, but we don't always necessarily think of people recovery. People affected by the disaster, healthcare professionals who come in contact with people affected by the disaster need to be also thought of in recovery.
Jamie, is there anything else that you can think of if we were putting out a challenge for people to come up with innovative ideas that solve problems? Are there any other areas? You've mentioned communications, you've mentioned some of the logistics, you've mentioned the water in terms of infrastructure. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think it'd be really cool if there was a way in which you could determine people coming to the emergency department before they even arrived. So if you could start to predict what your workload was going to be like, even half an hour to an hour in advance, you might be able to change the way in which you work in terms of what patients you should be moving now, who should you keep, what staff you need and so on, or even triaging remotely. So maybe you could somehow see a person affected by the disaster and go, nah, you don't need to come to hospital now, you can wait till tomorrow, or something like that, rather than people needing to physically turn up to the emergency department to make those decisions.
That's a great challenge. Thanks so much for spending some time with us, Jamie.
Thank you very much.